Good day and welcome to Glasnost in Our Time, where we test the old adage, to him who looks at history rationally, history looks rationally back. I'm your host, Anthony D'Agostino. It's February 2nd, 2023. NATO, with the United States and Germany in the lead, has agreed to send what amounts to a kind of tank army to Ukraine. Ukraine now demands, in addition, fighter aircraft. Germany and the United States both refuse for the moment. Ukraine is still confident that NATO always says no at first, but then succumbs to pressure and says yes. At the same time, there have been feelers from the White House to Russia about possible peace talks, raising the idea that these weapons may only be intended to arm Ukraine ahead of negotiations to end the war by summer. Who knows how that is going to turn out, and we all await it, hopefully. The German decision to arm Ukraine, taken a year ago, is said to mark a watershed in German foreign policy, what the Germans call a Zeitenwende. Does this mean only that Germany is going to increase military spending from now on? Or does it mean something more, the return of Germany perhaps as a great power? The return of Germany as a great power. To get some historical perspective on this, we turn to a distinguished historian of Germany, James J. Sheehan. He's professor emeritus of history at Stanford. He's the author of many acclaimed works over the years on German history. These include German Liberalism in the 19th Century, published by University of Chicago, 1978. German History, 1770 to 1866, published by Oxford in 1989. And Where Have All the Soldiers Gone, published by Houghton Mifflin in 2008. The last book, Where Have All the Soldiers Gone, a favorite of mine, one I have assigned to students and discussed at great length, it argues that the world wars and the Cold War have in effect resulted in Europeans, and especially Germans, putting aside more or less all of their military traditions and becoming what Sheehan calls civilian states. So we want to discuss this, and a very interesting idea, and see what's going on with it. So welcome to Glasnost, James Sheehan.
Thank you, Tony.
So there are a whole string of questions I want to ask you. Maybe I will end up asking you before we're through, but we might as well start with the first one. Does the turn of German policy on Ukraine, does this mark the end of your idea of the civilian state? That is the whole thesis, as I take it, of your book, Where Have All the Soldiers Gone?
Well, that's a very good question, to which I will give a decisive yes and no answer. Because I think in some ways, there is, as you suggest, a real possibility that this is a major turning point, not only in European history, but especially in German history. However, I think the difficulty that the Germans are having in living up to that famous speech of the chancellors on the 27th of February, the very difficulty they are having in living up to that suggests the residual power, the continued, what the social scientists might call path dependency of that civilian state that I described in the book. So it is certainly possible that the thesis I advanced in the book will need to be revised or junked. But I think that the game is still going, and it's a little too early to. I gave a paper not long ago in which I suggested the distinction between bad weather and climate change, and the world is full of bad weather that comes and goes and is locally important. Climate change, on the other hand, is a long-range, widely spread movement. And I think we're at a point now where it's beginning to look more and more like climate change in Europe, but still too early, for me at least, to say with absolute certainty.
When we generalize like this about the attitude of Europe or the attitude of Germany, where's Germany going, et cetera, are we talking about public opinion or are we talking about the discussion that's going on among, say, European historians, German historians in particular, the discussion about, national interest, policy in general?
Well, I think one of the features of politics generally, but more especially of the post-war European politics, is the very interesting gap that often emerges between the European electorate and European leaders. If you look, for example, at the attitude among the British political elite towards British membership in the European Union, it would turn out to be very different than the referendum on Brexit demonstrated. So I think there is a very interesting distance in the case that we're talking about now, and particularly in the German case, which is the one I know more about, is I don't think it's at all clear that the German public is as resolutely in favor of supporting Ukraine as the political class is. And I think one of the reasons why the government moves by fits and starts is that they're not at all sure that the public is, how much of the public is behind them. So your question is always a good one, and always, of course, very hard to answer. We've got public opinion polls which have their own problems. The one thing I think we can say for sure is we should not equate public opinion and the political class at any time. But I think especially now. We could talk more about that, but that would be my first answer.
Well, the Russians take the view that the political class in Germany is reasonably friendly toward them because of good economic connections. And that essentially Germany is being dragged into this attitude of belligerency, as the Russians see it, belligerency toward Russia.
Well, it seems to me that where the political class and public opinion agreed for at least the last 2 decades or more is that the most important function of the political system is economic. That's true of domestic politics, but it's also true in international relations. I think that Putin was counting on that, counting on the fact that German economic interests were so powerfully in favor of cheap energy particularly, but also of keeping the civilian state in business. I think he was counting on it, and I think he was extremely surprised that there was such immediate support among the parliament, which, with the exception of the 2 extreme parties, seems to be now with a remarkable consensus, a consensus that is always qualified by a certain reluctance, but a consensus that something, how much is the argument, but something should be done to continue to support the Ukrainians.
Well, I guess that whole question raises a related question, whether the turn that Germany's taking, does it just mean it's going to be a more faithful servitor of NATO, as would once again be the way Putin would put it, more faithful member of NATO, or is it going to be a power on its own? And once you start to talk about arming in a serious way, you start to raise the question of a degree of, how to put it, independence. Do you not?
Yeah, I have to say that the reemergence of Germany as a great power is pretty low on the list of things I worry about. I think that the European embedment, the way in which Germany is embedded in Europe, economically, politically, militarily in NATO, is so powerfully rooted in post-war German consciousness that I see very little chance that the Germans are going to rearm, that our grandfathers Wehrmacht will be back in the streets. I just don't see it.
Well, I think I'm definitely with you there. No quarrel there. But we're thinking about something slightly different, are we not? Europe is different. Europe used to be Europe with no Poland, for example. Poland did not count for anything. Now Poland counts for plenty. And, you know, the revival of Germany had been accompanied by the revival of Poland. So Poland has its own view of things, and especially its view of war and peace, my goodness. And now there's a whole question, is there not, of the European decision-making sort of shifting to the East, and the Poles counting for a whole lot more. What's the German relationship with the Poles? How do you think of this historically?
Well, of course, it's a troubled relationship, needless to say.
Needless to say.
Needless to say.
But perhaps we should say a little bit for our audience. We should tell them about the partitions and all the rest of that.
Well, I think going back to, as you say, going back to the 18th century, in which Prussia was one of the three Eastern monarchies that participated in the destruction of the Polish Commonwealth. I think dividing it into the three, which was one of the sources for the cooperation between the three Eastern monarchies, the Russians, the Austrians, and the Prussian, and then Germans, which really was one of the fundamental foundations for the long European peace in the 19th century. It was when that began to fall apart, you know better than I do, when that began to unravel, things got much worse and more complicated. Poland was always at the center of that. Poland, of course, was at the center of the Second World War, and the main victim, and the first, and in some ways worst, most egregious victim of the war. So those memories, which pop up now and again in different ways in the relationship between the two states, those memories are still very much there, probably more in Poland than they are in Germany. On the other hand, I think the Poles have made their plea for Europe. I think they have bad memories of the Germans in the past, but I think they have much fresher anxieties about the Russians in the present and the future. And that I think makes them much more eager to continue their commitment to NATO and to Europe. What you started at the beginning of your question, the reconfiguration of Europe, is certainly an important thing that we're just beginning to come to terms with. That is the old idea that a Franco-German axis could dominate the European Union and shape Europe's present and future. That, I think, is gone by the wayside. And I think it's a much more complicated situation. I think the European Union is and will, in some ways, always remain a work in progress. I think one of the difficulties we have in understanding the European Union is we are still stuck with the model of the nation state as the only way to organize political space. The European Union is not a nation state, has never been, and in my opinion, never will be one. And I think that gives it always a kind of unfinished quality, and not only in the minds of historians and analysts, but I think in minds of many Europeans who are either worried that it's going to go too far to becoming a nation state or hasn't gone far enough. That takes us a little bit away from your question, but I think it's
well, you know, Jim, I'm alarmed at the idea that Franco-German amity is, you know, that this is not the centerpiece of European politics. I'm alarmed at the idea. Everything since World War II, well, it was the dream back in the 20s too, you know, Franco-German amity. Gee, everything is based on that. Without that, we can't have anything. Now, if the French and the Germans don't count for anything, and if the Poles, for example, end up being the leading voice in NATO, where do we go? This is a dramatic reduction of the importance of the French, dramatic reduction, I would say, of the importance of both of them.
Well, it is certainly a reduction in their relative importance. I mean, I think they are still, Germany is still the most powerful economy in Europe, and it's still in many ways the motor for the European idea. But I also think that Franco-German cooperation is not going to turn into new rivalry. But I think both states have got to deal, and this takes us back to your earlier question about the tension between the political class and the public. Because I think in both France and Germany, there's a great deal more hostility in the public towards the European Union than there is among the politicians. I think it's going to be a long time before a leader of either country puts the European Union to a referendum for its public. So I think that's part of the story. I think that the relationship between Berlin and Paris and the triangular relationship between these two partners and Europe as an entity is still going to be a tension-filled one. I think it's remarkable, and this goes back to where we started, I think it's remarkable the degree to which the war in Ukraine has served as a unifying rather than a source of conflict, rather than a conflictual element. I mean, Europeans, if you look back over the last couple of decades, a lot of the ingredients that cause severe disruptions in both Europe and in NATO, energy policy, transatlantic relations, the wars in the Middle East, all of these elements might easily have been made worse by the Ukrainian affair, the Ukrainian war, than they have been. And I think for lots of different reasons, and I think Washington deserves some credit for this, Ukraine has been a source of cohesion rather than of conflict within Europe. Now, how long that will last will depend a lot on how this war goes on.
Doesn't the conflict inside Europe being eliminated, doesn't the rise of European unity, isn't that on the basis of a unity against Russia? And weren't the previous questions about how to run the peace, and now the questions are how to make war, how to promote war against Russia, how to stop Russia in this huge imperialist campaign. For example, I heard some German historians on a German television show, not historians, excuse me, they're not historians, they were public people, publicists, journalists, and there was one academic, and they had a Polish official on the show. And the Polish official ended up admonishing these Germans and telling them, you Germans don't understand. It's a German show, by the way, in English. You Germans don't understand, what the last 300 years has meant in Central and East Central Europe. You don't, 300 years, they said. So the Germans have not understood. So the Poles, if they're talking about 300 years, they're talking about the eclipse of Poland as a great power from the time when we spoke of Poland from sea to sea. The eclipse of Poland over those 300 years. So what they were saying to the Germans, as I got it, was you have to reverse your notion of the whole, big span of European history to accommodate this, what would you call it, an intermarium view. It's the kind of view that Pilsudski took in the 30s. I think it's come back very sharply now for us, and we have to consider all this anew, don't you think?
I think the Polish-German example that you gave is a really excellent example of that fact that people learn from two kinds of histories. their sufferings and failures and their triumphs and successes. Now, for a long time, the Germans were in that second group. They learned from their disasters. I think now the lessons of history that the Germans have learned are the lessons of their extraordinary success since 1945. And after all, it's almost as long from 1945 to the present as it is from 1871 to 1945. So this is a big chunk of history. And it's a chunk of history that has gone extremely well for the Germans when you think about it. They have the best government they've ever had. They've got a thriving economy. They reunified their country, or unified, I think we should say. They unified their country peacefully. They are accepted in the councils of Europe as they hadn't been in the immediate post-war. So for all of those reasons, the impetus to German policy, or the inertia in German policy towards Ukraine, comes from the memory of these successes and their reluctance to give them up or put them at risk. The Poles, on the other hand, have got a very different history, as you suggest, a history of division, of decline, a history of enormous suffering, then a history of having when the Western powers go to war in 1939 for Poland, and then 6 years later sit back and see it fall into the hands of another set of dictators. So, you know, the Polish history is, as you suggested, a very different one. Someone said, I forget who it was at the moment, someone said that every foreign office has the same atlases on the shelves, but a very different map of the world in their minds. And I think that the German-Polish example is a very good illustration of that.
That's so good. I love those little aphorisms. That.
I wish I could take credit for it, but it was someone else who said it first.
It says it beautifully. But okay, so couldn't we make this, add a little footnote to this, that the world wars were essential to the creation of Poland, and that this was actually pointed out by Polish historians of the so-called Kraków school, the historical school, they call it in Poland. It's the school of hostility to Polish positivism. That is, the Polish idea that they have to have good relations with Russia to survive. Roman Dmowski was the great proponent of this. So they opposed him, and they made the argument, hey, World War I was sent by God. We were nothing before World War I. And after World War I, we came into existence, and maybe the best thing for us will be something like World War I again, which they actually got, these people from this certain narrow point of view, which they actually got in World War II. Actually, from the standpoint of their geography, you could say that that Poland, Stalin's Poland, put it that way, Stalin's Poland was the most beautifully integrated from the standpoint of national self-determination, the most beautifully integrated Polish state that they've ever had. All the creation of the world wars. So maybe, the Poles can end up with this dangerous idea. And by the way, I think this would be a distortion to say that all Poles think this way. We're only talking about a few almost national mystics, strictly speaking, who talk about foreign policy, the equivalent of Alexander Dugin in Russia. Mm-hmm. So I shouldn't generalize about all the Poles this way. But there is this strain of Polish thought, which is enormously extremist, warlike, etc. And we even have people in the United States who feel exactly the same. I've had students, in fact, one very prominent student of mine, who I won't bother to mention, argues exactly this way on behalf of this long-run Polish thing. And I don't see how the Germans can possibly breathe this air.
I didn't get that your last sentence.
I don't think the Germans can breathe this air. I don't think they can even enter into a rational discussion of these things. Um, um, if the Germans and the Poles, if I can't, first of all, I can't see Germany faithfully following Poland in foreign policy. But more than that, it seems to me a German-Polish dialogue is definitely on the order of the day about these big historical questions. And, there has to be some kind of a debate, some kind of a discussion about these things.
Well, I think that's true. And there are still those historical wounds, particularly having to do with the expulsion of Germans after 1945. The Germans built a museum to not so much celebrate, but to record this extraordinary amount of suffering and displacement. That's an issue that the Poles feel obviously very different about.
What are the Germans going to say about the demand for reparations?
Well, I suspect they're not going to be very eager for that. And I mean, they've already paid reparations to Israel. I think I think as you suggest, they have a very different view of the world and a very different now, a history that they don't quite share. I mean, down to 1945, the Poles and the Germans shared a terrible history. Then there was this long period in which West Germany went its own way. What did West Germans care about Poland? Not very much, right? I mean, the expellees were integrated into West German society with remarkable speed when you think about it. I mean, they sort of became invisible except for a very small number of organizations. Germans were much more interested in Tuscany in California than they were in Krakow or Warsaw. It wasn't something that occupied them. Well, now they're back in the same boat, and it's going to take time for them to figure out how they're going to live together. I think, though, the political logic is, I hope I don't regret having said this, but the political logic is much more in favor of cooperation than it is in conflict.
You would think. Yeah. Suppose we were in a German classroom now and teaching German history or teaching European history. That'd be better. Teaching European history, some kind of basic European history course, and we had to consider all these massive generalizations about German. And this is the thing I love about getting a distinguished historian in an interview, try to get him to generalize on a big scale about all sorts of things. And the issue comes up in this classroom, that Hitler argued that Germany doesn't have a political tradition. And that there is this tradition among the German historians that perhaps you know who I'm thinking about, Meineck and other German historians, that we have no political tradition, so we only have Machiavellianism or Machiavellism. So the notion of reason of state is practically we have to treat it practically like a discovery, a German discovery of science of politics, in this exalted way. When we think of it that way, reason of state and all the rest of that, who represents reason of state? There's a Bismarck tradition, there's a Stresemann tradition. What traditions, what politicians, what icons can we Germans look to for a rational, sensible attitude toward foreign policy?
Well, I think Adenauer is the figure.
Adenauer.
That is the figure that we're now.
Yeah.
And once again, it's been a long time since 1945. Longer than, the Nazis lasted 12 years. They managed to do an incredible amount of damage to themselves and anybody around them in that time, but it was a short period. A great deal in Germany survived that 12 years and provided, I think, the basis for for what came next. So I think the German political tradition was partly a tradition that was quite a, well, let me begin again. The Germans had a political tradition. It was a different one from the French and the British and the Americans. It was a tradition based on the state as a source of power and authority. It was a tradition in which democracy had a role, but a very different role than it did in the Atlantic powers. A tradition that was then perverted by the Nazis. Perverted is not a strong enough word, turned into a murderous instrument by the Nazis, but which then reemerged. So if you look at German political institutions, West German and now pan-German political institutions, there is in them a democratic element, but the administrative element, the bureaucratic and state element is much stronger than it is certainly in the United States. I think that is the basis for German stability and for German sense of themselves.
How about Germans outside of Europe? The Germans have a relationship with the Chinese, certainly an economic relation. You could say that Germans have relied for the US for security on the Russians for cheap energy and on the Chinese for a market. I mean, one hears this generalization. And I guess the relationship between Germany and Russia in the energy field looks like it's not going to revive, unlikely that it will revive. But the Germans seem to have the feeling that right now, don't you think, that they want to keep this relationship with China, that if they're going to join the United States in quarreling with Russia, that they don't want to join the United States if it's going to quarrel with China. Although there are some who argue about that too. But I think Scholz seems to feel that he does not want to have bad relations with China. As a matter of fact, he wants to enhance the relationship with China. Does that make sense in today's world?
Well, I think it makes a powerful economic sense because, as you know, the German economy is much more dependent on exports than, for example, the American. The German economy is also tied up to the automobile. I forget what the figures are, but they are really quite striking when you think about not simply cars, but all the things that go, various kinds of devices that other car makers use. So their ties to what was the internal and combustion engine is very strong. That was a big export to the Chinese. They also make a lot of precision tools. If you go to your optician and you look at what he's got,
look at the instruments.
It's German, right? They don't make textiles anymore, but they do make high quality textile machines. So all of that is a very important part of the German economy. A lot of it, of course, was fueled by relatively cheap energy from Russia. And the fact that there was not, as I think Putin expected, a crisis when that energy supply began to be diminished, not by no means ended, but diminished. I think that's one of the big surprises of this winter.
Yeah. But this China relationship, you think it's going to be possible? There's a German politician named Lars Klingbeil, a social democratic leader, who has said that he thinks Germany can support the Quad, that it makes sense for Germany, the Quad, the alliance of the United States, Japan, Australia, and presumably India. Hopefully India. One wonders about that, but that the Germans can go along and kind of support this against China. I don't know. Does that make sense for Germany?
Well, I think, it's not unusual for there to be political rivalries and deep economic connections. I think as long as China continues to display restraint, I think if China were to do to Taiwan what Russia did to Ukraine, that would make the kind of relationship difficult, if not impossible. I think as long as China continues to take an essentially defensive stand militarily, I think that this economic cooperation and political tension can continue to coexist.
We're in the position of the intellectuals of the 30s who were saying to ourselves, gee, if there's peace, there'll be peace. And the opposite, if there's war, we don't know the answer to that.
Well, and in a way they were right? I mean,
well, sure, if there's peace, you can solve all sorts of problems.
Right. That's right. And the overwhelming majority of people in the 30s, including the overwhelming majority of Germans, wanted some kind of peace.
Yeah.
They wanted other things as well, but they wanted
as is the case today, I think. Don't you?
Pardon me?
As is the case today. We don't want another Cold War.
We do not.
We don't mind a certain degree of antagonism, to be sure, and we've got a serious quarrel, about various things, ideological things, and whatever. But war, that's a bit much.
Absolutely, and I think the best argument for continuing to support the Ukrainians is to make clear that to violate those rules has a very high price indeed. I think in 2014, when Putin violated these rules and invaded and took over parts of Ukraine, got away with it, did not suffer from it. I think that was a very unfortunate precedent. War is always awful. Come on, we all know that. It's always awful. But
and we hope the Poles feel that way too.
Yeah, the Poles are not a civilian state in the way that the Poles didn't have many troops in Iraq, but they did take casualties at a very
and they're taking casualties right now.
Yeah,
in Ukraine. Casualties, they say, in the thousands.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And I think to go back to the question you posed about how the expansion of Europe is going to change the nature of the European project, I think that's one of the most interesting questions now for us, right?
Going to be the centerpiece, don't you think? A centerpiece of world politics.
Yeah. And so that shift in the center of gravity, if we can think of it that way, and this puts Germany closer to the center than when Germany's link was over the Rhine rather than the other way. So, Tony, there was a while there when I was afraid that European history was getting boring. Right?
Same here.
And it was like that famous remark from Orson Welles in the Third Man, where he said the Swiss had centuries of, but I think that danger is past.
It's past, unfortunately. We're speaking with James Sheehan, a distinguished historian of Germany, perhaps no one more distinguished as a historian of Germany. Let me ask you a little broader question. You gave an address when you were head of the American Historical Association. Professor Sheehan was the president of the American Historical Association. You gave an address to the association in which you talked about as I understood it, as well as I could possibly understand it. You talked about what I get to be a normative history of Europe, as opposed to what we might call a realist history of Europe, which I think you use a term, it was to look at it in this realist way was almost to reify it. And that there was this institutional structure that Europe inherited from oldest times, from the times of the Holy Roman Empire, when there was one united Latin Christendom. Could you speak to us a little bit about what we should appreciate about this normative history? If I've got this right, I may have misunderstood you entirely.
It sounds pretty good. I'm not sure I entirely understand what I said then, or what I think the European idea, in as much as there is one, does have, as you say, deep roots. But what they are, it becomes increasingly difficult to define. I mean, I'm almost reminded about what St. Augustine said about time. He understood perfectly what it was till someone asked him to explain it. And I think a lot of us understand Europe, but when we try to say what it is very difficult. There is, I think, a powerful legal tradition. I think there is a tradition of the separation of powers that comes from the separation of church and state, which forced Europeans to think about institutions in terms of coexistence and rivalry rather than of coherence. Ranke says that the relationship between church and state is the most important fact of European history. Well, that may not be true anymore, but I think in terms of Europe's past, this did force Europeans to think about a multiplicity of coexisting institutions rather than a cohesive united state, which is the tradition in many other political systems. So if I were looking for a normative institutional way of understanding the European experience, as problematic as all these things always are, I think that's where I would look.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating discussion, and I wish we could go on, get a couple of glasses of tea and talk into the night, but we have to conclude. So thank you so much. Thank you to James Sheehan for this illuminating discussion, and to Glassnos listeners, I have to say that we have to say goodbye now. And we will see you next time, when we will continue to ask the question, we've tried everything else, why don't we try thinking about it?